I understand that obviously it was a very long session that we just sat through, but just a little bit more to continue with before we break for morning tea. Thanks then to Christy for chairing that session. As she mentioned, my name's Michael Washbourne. I'm from the editorial team at Paydirt Media, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on downstream. Obviously, it's a very broad topic, but we're going to try and narrow it down into a couple of key areas in the short sort of 30 minutes that we have. Just very quickly to introduce our panellists. To my immediate left is Claire Spooner from the Faraday Battery Challenge, I think it is, and obviously we heard a great presentation from Claire yesterday. The good-looking rooster in the middle is Nick Rathjen from Green Technology Metals, or GT1, I think we'll probably refer to it. Obviously, we also heard from Nick yesterday. And to the very far right is Andrew Warland, the Managing Director of International Graphite, who you will hear from later today. So I'll perhaps actually start with you, Andrew, because as I said, we will hear from you later today. But last year, International Graphite listed on the ASX with a very dedicated downstream strategy, which is a bit different to your sort of standard mining company IPO. Can you perhaps explain to us about why that was such an appealing investment option for the company and obviously the shareholders that you now have on your register?
Sure, thanks, Michael. Essentially, the DNA of International Graphite was founded by the two principal founders of the company who were metallurgists and engineers, and they spent most of the 2000s in a private consultancy working on graphite feasibility studies. So between the two of them and their team, they probably worked on most ASX and AIM listed graphite projects that were taking their projects through feasibility in Africa and Australia, both, as I said, AIM and ASX listed. And in the process of that, and understanding the nature of coarse versus fine flake and how the markets were changing for those end products, got to spend a lot of time in China. And as probably everybody's familiar with, all graphite at this point in time and has found its way to China for downstream processing, and their interactions with those markets and battery manufacturers and anode producers in China, and then more broadly around the Asia Pacific region, led them to believe that there was an opportunity to create a diversified supply chain outside of China. And so they spent quite a considerable amount of time working up downstream processes for the treatment of graphite concentrates through micronizing, spheritizing, purification, and ultimately coating products, and offering that to the gigafactories in North America, Europe, and Asia. And in fact, their first incarnation of International Graphite when we were private was to locate a facility in the UAE, and the idea being that the African concentrates would go up to the UAE, where it'd take advantage of HF as a purification step, which was abundant in the UAE, and then get the coated graphite battery anode product out to the European gigafactories. So that was the genesis of International Graphite. COVID hit, making things very difficult to achieve in a private world in the UAE and overseas when your management team's here in Perth. And ultimately, what led us to the current stage of the company was a group that owned a deposit down in Hopeton that had a significant fines component to it, and was perfectly suitable for battery anode, loved what we were doing in the downstream, and we linked the two together, and that's the genesis of International Graphite.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. Nick, if I can turn to you now. Obviously, GT1 is one of many companies that are now starting to establish quite a big presence in Canada, and it's looking like there's going to be a very significant lithium hub there. Obviously, that then paves the way potentially for a centralised sort of processing facility. Can you sort of touch on about what the appeal might be to investors about being part of, I guess, a developing new industry in a Tier 1 jurisdiction?
Yeah, sure. So probably a very brief history of lithium. 10 years ago, there was one hard rock producer, and they were sending it all to China, primarily for technical purposes, not batteries. Now where we've got to is the market's now becoming more mature. And if you look at a Venn diagram, traditionally you would have the miner, and then you'd have the chemical converter, and they'd have this small crossover where they would need to deliver a specific product of an SC6. and that was designed by Greenbushes. But it was just that small fit, and you had to fit that perfect little window, and it never really was the perfect fit for the miner, and it never really was the perfect fit for the converter, but somehow it was where the market landed. And now where we're getting to is the miner is obviously become more capable, there's more experience, more capabilities to support mining, it's more conventional, and so their confidence to produce that spec is great, but also it's not in their perfect outcomes or economics to deliver that for the mine, and also the capabilities downstream for them to go down is now far greater. And if you were to pull those two pieces together, you know, obviously there's a huge benefit that everyone's chasing, but there's a benefit to both pieces where the sum of the two pieces isn't 2, it is 3. And then for us as a business, everyone's chasing the upside, but everyone's also looking around to find who's actually going to deliver that project. So you really need that team and that capability to do that, and that's where GT1 has really built that, backed off by Primera and a few other key capability support providers. And probably the major supporting factor is government. There really needs to be an impetus to actually go and deliver it and support the miner, which we're very privileged to have Canada, who, you know, second to none in terms of what support they're giving us as a miner and as a chemical converter. So that's what's giving us the confidence to deliver our timetable.
Claire, I could see you doing an awful lot of nodding during both of those two overviews from, I guess, our upstream sort of candidates here. You're obviously a bit further down the value chain in a lot of ways, as a sort of a midstream participant in the sector. I guess in terms of that midstream entry, sort of where do you start to look at the potential sources of the materials and how you get involved in that process?
For us, it's really about creating that ecosystem and making sure that we are creating the right environment for batteries to actually be produced and manufactured in the UK. And as part of that, we need to ensure that we have that secure system, that secure supply coming through. So for us, what we're actually trying to do is, through the research and innovation activities we're undertaking, we've provided, you know, a huge amount of research base with the Faraday Institution. We've provided a scale-up facility in UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, and that is attracting quite an ecosystem to the UK. We've got something like $2.7 billion American dollars worth of tech startup money coming to the UK, and that is one of the ways we'll secure that supply. Because as a country, and indeed the globe, we know there's a lot of demand for the precious rare earth minerals, for the precious critical materials that we have in this country, in Australia, to actually come through. But the world is changing, and there are different acts coming into being, there are different incentives coming in. So we have the rules of origin taking place in Europe, where 65% of the cell battery, the value of the cell battery should come within Europe. And that does start to make you think, well, where's the first processing going to take place? Where's the mining going to take place? In the UK, we do have mining reserves of lithium, but they are not at all in the same, you know, proportions that you have in Australia. But we have great companies working at that, from Green Lithium to Cornish Lithium, British Lithium. And they are undertaking that mining element, but we are always going to need that worldwide global supply of materials coming into the country.
No, just to expand on that a little bit further, and we were having a bit of a chat at the back of this room yesterday, that the UK, yes, as you said, is sort of not known now as a traditional mining jurisdiction, but very much is emerging as a likely downstream destination. You know, why does it sort of, you feel the UK has sort of gone down that path in being able to, I guess, be that final home for production of these metals and products that we all require?
You know, you might not realise it, but the UK, our manufacturing industry is worth £200 billion every year. We are not necessarily, as you know, you're going to think of Germany as one of those big manufacturing, but actually no, we're there. We also create something like 850,000 brand new cars every year. So it's a really big part of our manufacturing base is delivering for the UK. And if I touch on EV cars, it's something like, it's about 200,000 jobs, I think it creates in the UK. Our overall manufacturing sector is something like 2.5 million jobs. We really are grounded in manufacturing more than perhaps is realised. And so because of that, we need to make sure that we've built up our ecosystem to ensure that we do have a secure line of activities. Manufacturing is key to us, absolutely. And with batteries, we think it really plays to our strengths because we have this great research environment, you know. We've been there since the beginning of lithium research taking place and being discovered. We've been at that forefront, and I think it's the innovations that we can have around this that we're really keen on. We have fantastic companies looking at cathode materials and cathode batteries, developing them, like Nexion and Ekion and Nibolt. And these areas really are, you know, it's quite vibrant and it's exciting, and I think that's why we're kind of a natural home for modern battery manufacturing.
Yeah. Well, I'll come back to you, Andrew. As you mentioned China in your opening sort of spiel there, and I think a lot of people obviously be aware that China sort of dominates and well and truly leads the market and a lot of the downstream sort of processing opportunities. Why can a company like International Graphite, and even to a broad extent Australia, start to be competitive against the might of China?
Well, I mean, if you were designing an industry from scratch, there's no way in the world you would export a concentrate from Western Australia to China at $1,000 a tonne and watch China sell it for $10,000 a tonne. And that's what the graphite industry, broadly speaking, does at this point in time. And there's reasons for that historically. We all understand that as mining companies, we've been compelled to sell our resources downstream to other countries who have got the infrastructure in place. But if we were doing it from scratch, which is perhaps what we've got the opportunity to do, you wouldn't do that. And so if you're purely selfish about it, the economic drivers for doing it are compelling. Are there IP restraints to it? In our view, no, because we've done the work in countries on different deposits, and other companies in our position in North America also in Australia have come to the same conclusion, that there's no intellectual reason why we can't be a significant downstream producer. So then it comes back to, okay, what in our cost structure would limit us from participating? Historically, there are really two reasons why you go downstream from a cost perspective overseas. One is power, because most of the downstream industries are power hungry, and second is labour. Now, if you're believing in the ESG component, labour ought not to be a reason to go overseas. And in the case of power, I think we're all understanding that the power networks and the infrastructure are evolving. And certainly when International Graphite's positioned down in Collie, which is on the hub of the historical transmission systems for Western Australia's power, which is evolving to greener power, then we think we're going to be every bit as competitive as certainly China, and every bit as competitive as anybody internationally, with the exception of those that are tapped into a hydro network. So I think from our perspective, there's no impediment for us to going downstream. It's by far and away the best ESG credential alternative for us to develop our assets, and it retains all the value in Western Australia for you guys. I mean, it's our assets. Why would we dilute it to other countries?
Well, and Nick, just coming back to you, obviously, for those not aware, that Nick's previously had some experience with a Zimbabwean-based lithium developer that did very well down there. But just on that subject of jurisdictional risks, what are the obvious ones that you sort of see in, I guess, for the destination of the minerals compared to the source of the materials?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I hate throwing stones, so I won't throw any stones, and I'll probably focus more on the Canadian side and why it's so attractive for us. But the key thing is that for any chemical conversion process, same for graphite, we've touched on, it's reagent, chemicals, power and feedstock. And those make up over 80% of your cost base. There's obviously the human capital element as well, but in the grand scheme of things, not a major component. The feedstock's the primary need. You've got to build it close proximity to a feedstock, ideally, not only for transport costs, but the ESG factor, the green emissions footprint. But then coming to that, you need the reagents and you need the power. And every process requires different forms of power, different forms of reagents. And what we've found in Canada, and particularly where Thunder Bay is located, is it has an existing port. It's got access to those reagents. and has hydropower throughout the province. But only no hydropower doesn't actually feed plants or chemical conversion plants currently. You're going to require gas, which there is a gas stream that runs through it. But I think where the market's going is the technological advances that are coming up are sort of changing that game. A good example is there's new technology that's come out of China, leading the way technically in terms of lithium, but they can take DSO material and convert it all the way up to hydroxide in a single phase process. These are the advantages that we will look to capture, but in terms of jurisdiction, it's definitely power, stability. You also want government stability there, changes in rules and regulations, things like that. Not only what political government's in power, but it's actually what policies are in place that give you that confidence, particularly for a chemical plant that's really a 30-year mine life or asset life. So they're the key points.
Thanks, Nick. And Claire, is that something that, as a midstream participant, the similar sorts of things that you look for?
Yeah, I mean, we're very aware of the price of energy in the UK. It has spiked because of the invasion in the Ukraine. It spiked because of that. And so, Scotland, I actually come from the original Perth. And in Scotland, what they have there is a number of hydro plants, but they're not in the right place to be able to meet the needs. And it really is making sure that if you have sustainable energy, that it's in the right location as well, so next to a port. And those locations are a little bit more unique. They aren't as prevalent. So that's one thing that we do pay attention to in the UK. But then on top of that, it's that skilled workforce, making sure that there's people ready to go who are trained. And that's not just looking at studentships, PhDs. That's making sure that you have apprenticeships. That's making sure you have people who are being reskilled, who already have existing skills base to go from. And one thing we found in our work at the Faraday Battery Challenge is that people who are really good at making batteries are not just chemists. Bakers are fantastic. They can be reskilled because they're used to playing around with the chemistry. Same with hairdressers. They are used to playing around with chemistries, mixing things in an appropriate fashion. So we're doing quite a lot of work in really understanding what reskilling is required and where you can take a skill set that you wouldn't necessarily think is the right approach at all and just reposition them so that they can enter this wonderful new world of batteries.
There you go. For all the hairdressers and bakers in the audience, let's make sure we get you into the mining and downstream processing industries. I will open up the floor to some questions shortly, but just wanted to come back once more again to Andrew. I was talking actually to a couple of investors who were at this conference at last night's drinks, and one of the conversations that we had was around that the attraction of investing in a battery minerals company versus, say, a gold company, there's not a lot of difference. But if the battery minerals company has a downstream option in their, perspectives, it actually makes them more appealing. Is that something you've sort of found in the short time you've had International Graphite listed?
Well, certainly the Western Australian angle for us has been really well received. So, and the talk that Toby gave a few presentations ago, I thought was illuminating around the ESG component, because it's hard to imagine how any graphite developer could get their product to the market in a more ESG-friendly way than mining at Hopeton and treating at Collie and then exporting the anode from Collie to the global gigafactories. I doubt there's a higher value supply chain out there. So from our perspective, being able to brand ourselves as Western Australian has been a real benefit to us as a company, and I think our investors really like the parochial component of it, so we'll keep on promoting that.
Fantastic. And Nick, GT1's obviously in the process of building up the resource and starting to go through the study phases for the projects over there in Canada. But I guess the inevitable question of offtake starts to come into the equation at some point in time. Can you perhaps share sort of with the audience about when you start to, really seriously entertain where that product might end up?
Yeah, sure. So with off-takers, 5 years ago, was going to China trying to find an off-take partner. Now we're getting code calls almost weekly. So it's a totally different world where you're not having to deliver it on their doorstep. They're coming to you and accepting it where you are and what your plan is, which is great. In terms of where we think our product is going to end up, it's hard to picture it leaving North America. The main reason is because if you look at the supply chain across North America, you've got every a blue chip name that's building battery plants, that's got car manufacturing facilities already in place that's being converted to be EV or hybrid, cathode plants being put in place, all within trucking and rail distance from where we're talking about. So if we can fit that front end piece, we wouldn't see that product leaving North America.
Is it a similar case, sort of, I guess, for UK? I mean, UK obviously we've gone through Brexit and all that sort of stuff, but is it a similar thing with UK and I guess to a wider extent Europe?
So in the UK, most of our cars that we manufacture are actually exported. It's something like 8 out of 10. So we would anticipate that we would still be, once producing the car and manufacturing it, that we would still be exporting it to our partners. So we would definitely be not necessarily seeing the entirety of the battery staying in the UK. We see it as an export opportunity once it's at that final stages.
Fantastic. All right, well, I will ask the audience if they have any questions that they'd like to ask. Just looks like the boss wants to ask a question, which is never good because it means I haven't asked the right ones.
It maybe means we haven't answered correctly.
We haven't answered correctly as well, yeah.
Thank you very much. Dominic Piper from PEDA, certainly not the boss. Can I just ask the panelists, and I don't know, each of you may want to take it, about recycling. It strikes me that this is sort of the next generation of the circular economy around battery minerals and critical minerals. For the two gentlemen involved in companies, have your companies considered where the industry and yourselves might go in recycling space, and then to Claire's work at Faraday and elsewhere in Innovate UK around recycling and how that looks in the future?
Thanks, Dominic. From our perspective, it's not something that we've spent a significant amount of time on in the 12 to 18 months that we've sort of been in that listed company environment. Obviously, we're aware of the benefits of the recycling, and clearly, if you believe 10% of what Toby's graph showed on the International Energy Association's forecasts, then recycling is going to still play an important part, because no one knows how that level of minerals are going to find their way into the market by that 2050 timeframe. So I think recycling is clearly an important lever. I know Jez McManus didn't mention it in his Neometals basket of commodities. So from a graphite perspective, it's probably something we need to do more on.
Yeah, from our perspective, it's absolutely going to be needed for the supply chain. Every little bit is going to help, but more importantly, it's the right thing to do. When we talk about our operations, we recycle water, we recycle reagents. There's no point in doing all that great work and then throwing it back in the ground in the end. If there's something that can be recovered, it should be recovered. And it's great to see that there are parties that are taking that battle on and looking like they're winning. That's only going to create a more sustainable industry for everyone. So I think it's a really good positive move.
Well, Claire, just on that, where does the recycling fit in, I guess, the sort of research that you're undertaking?
It is hugely important. We have a really large project called Relib that looks purely at battery recycling. And it is so unbelievably complex, because once you've got your materials all put together to make your battery just perfect, well then at the end of its life, and maybe the end of its second life is probably the way to think about it, you've then got to tear that apart. And how do you get those constituent parts out of it? It's a massive, wicked problem that we're facing. But linked to that is where's the market for it? You might get a bit of black mass. What are you doing with the product after you've torn it apart? That doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean. And actually, we really do need to tackle this. And one of the interesting things about recycling is there isn't enough current EVs on the market for us to recycle. They're not there yet. So we have maybe a 10-year lag where we're actually going to be ramping up our industry to do the recycling and undertake that activity, but there won't be enough to actually supply the EV market. We're growing at too exponential a rate to actually that be the only source of materials coming into it. So we do need the mining to still continue and do its great, fantastic work in a sustainable ESG way, absolutely. But it's going to be a bigger component as we head towards 2050. But it's something that we're certainly taking very seriously, and it's not just the RELA programme that we have as part of the Faraday Battery Challenge. We have so much work on recycling going on in the UK, but it's really understanding where your market, once you've recycled it, what are you going to do with it, and making sure that you get as much value out of the material as possible, I think is really the key element.
Fantastic question, Dom. Do we have any other questions from the audience? We still have a bit of time before our schedule finish. No, otherwise it might be a potential early mark for everyone. So if everyone could thank our three panellists. We're breaking now for morning tea, but just a quick reminder, at 1 o'clock down in the Uma restaurant downstairs, the Indonesian government is having an investment seminar and lunch, and I believe there is still some capacity for anyone interested in attending. So if that's something that interests you, please make your way there just before 1 o'clock. Otherwise, we'll see you back here very shortly for the start of session 6. Thank you.